Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. Organizations like yours are still paying vendors by check, and fraudsters know that, which means that fraudsters are still perpetrating check fraud. So, for a 5-step process to avoid paper check fraud, keep listening. Welcome to episode 305, Avoiding Paper Check Fraud When Paying Your Vendors in 5 Steps. Now, I will confess here that this is one of the monthly webinars that I'm going to play. And what that's going to be, this was back in April. And so if you missed that webinar, you can definitely listen to this podcast episode. And I'm also going to put a link in the show notes so that if you would like to go and watch it, or at least download the presentation and handouts, you can do that. Now, what is this webinar on? Well, the description is think check payments are immune to payment fraud. Fraudsters are still targeting your vendor's checks to perpetrate fraud, and this type of fraud is expected to reach $24 billion in 2024. In today's check tampering climate, companies need to mitigate internal and external fraud risk inherent in the check payment process. So from the collection of remittance address through check presentation and payment at your bank, this webinar will show you how to avoid fraud at each step. Then you can discover how the sponsor, which is Repay, how their payment technology can mitigate your risk of fraud, save you time, and reduce your costs with AP automation. So there are 4 things that you're going to discover, or hopefully you would discover. One is 5 steps to avoid payment fraud when paying vendors by check. 2 is how to protect your payments from collection to payment, right, at each step. And then 3, what steps and processes you can do to avoid paper check fraud. And then 4, what your bank can do to help you avoid paper check fraud. So I'm going to go ahead and play it, and I hope you enjoy it. All right, well, we are right at the top of the hour, and we'll get started on today's webinar. Now, this is part of a monthly webinar series called In 5 Steps. So I talk about different topics in 30 minutes on a monthly basis. You can follow the hashtag In 5 Steps on LinkedIn if you want to make sure that you register for all available webinars, or you can just go to my website, Debra Richardson, DebraRRichardson.com, and check out the webinars. There should be a link in one of the slides to that as well. Now, today's webinar is on avoiding paper check fraud when paying your vendors, of course, in 5 steps. And my name is Debra R. Richardson. I have a quick bio for me in just a moment, but this webinar is sponsored by Repay, and more on them in a moment. Now, here's some housekeeping items before we begin. This session is being recorded, and tomorrow, this same time, you will receive a link to that recorded webinar session in case you want to watch it again or maybe share it with some of your colleagues. Now, fair warning, that will be that link will be a different link than what you signed in today, because I want to be able to also have you or your colleagues download the handouts, and I can't do that with this current link. So you will have a new link to the recording that'll also allow you to download the handouts. So feel free, rewatch or share that with your colleagues. Now, you can submit your questions anytime. This is a very fast webinar. It's 30 minutes. Make sure you put it in the Q&A. So when we get to that Q&A section at the end of the webinar, hopefully up to 5 minutes, I'll be able to answer as many questions as possible, and your question will already be in there if you put it in there when you're thinking about it. Also, there are 5 handouts today. Usually I don't have all the way up to 5 because that's the limit, but there are 5. There is a PDF of this presentation, and all of the links that I talk about or that you see in this presentation, when you download the PDF version, they will be clickable from there. I also have, if you like, trainings on vendor setup and maintenance processes, how to avoid fraud, fines, bad vendor data. I did put a link to information on vendor process training that I have. And then there are 3 actually very informative handouts from Repay. So make sure that you download those handouts. Now, a quick bio from me. Again, I am Debra R. Richardson. I used to be a practitioner just like you. I was an accounts payable senior manager over global vendor setup and maintenance. We maintained 140,000 vendors across 7 different ERPs. I don't talk about it much, but for 2, maybe 3 years, 2.5 years or so of that time period, I was also over all of the payments as well. And that was a Fortune 15 company. And so we had probably in excess 25,000 checks that we wrote per month. I know it's a pain. Hopefully they're not still doing that. But we ran into all the same issues that are still prevalent today with check fraud. So let's talk about that. So the agenda, very simple. We're first going to start with fraudsters are still targeting checks, and we'll talk about what they're doing with them and how they're getting them. And then we will jump into the 5 steps, right? Avoiding check fraud when paying your vendors. And then we'll have again up to 5 minutes for Q&A. But first, I'm going to launch the only poll question that is a part of this webinar. So you only have one you need to answer. So let me go ahead and launch that. And that question is very simple. How many checks do you cut each month to pay your vendors? Is it A, 0 to 50, B, 51 to 200, C, 200 plus, or D, you're just unsure? Now, if that were me when I was in my last practitioner role, I would have to check C, right? 200 or more. So let's see where everyone is. I tried to get, let's see if we can get more than half or maybe up to 70%. We've got 65% now. So go ahead, I'll leave this open for about 10 more seconds, and then we will take a look at the results. So I've got about 69% that voted, 73. So you know what, we are good to go, and we're at the 10 seconds anyway. So let's go ahead. I'm going to close that out, and then I'm going to share the results here. There were the highest, like me, 55% said 200 or more. The next highest was 18% at 51 to 200. And then we had a tie, 14% each at 0 to 50, or just unsure. So thanks everyone for that. Participating in the poll, had great response. Actually, 85% of you voted, so really good. All right, so let's talk about the fact that fraudsters are still targeting checks, right? This trend has continued to go up really since the pandemic, and some say that it started with the IRS sending out all those stimulus checks and them just being available, right? And we'll talk about why. But let's talk about the fact that one, Bank Automation News says that check fraud is expected to reach $24 billion in 2024. And here is what the fraudsters are doing with your vendor checks. And keep in mind that these can be perpetrated by internal employees as well as by external fraudsters. So let's talk about the first thing is theft. So how are they getting them? So they're stealing them. Bottom line, they're stealing the checks to use for fraudulent purposes. Either the checks are being left unattended when you print them in your place of business, and your internal fraudsters are just walking right by and picking them up, or they're being stolen from those blue boxes, right? We see all the time. If you check out like the U.S. Inspection Service, go on their page, there are all kind of posters about mail carriers being robbed for those keys. And when they get those keys, the fraudsters will open up the mailbox, they'll take out all the checks, and that's how they're getting them. Now, what are they doing with those checks when they get them? Now that they have the checks, they can forge them. So that means signing a check without authorization, or really in this case, if they steal them, endorsing the check on the back and just making it payable and just depositing that check. They can also wash the check, right, using chemicals to remove the information from the check. The fraudster can just add their name, deposit amount, whatever they want to deposit that amount. They can change it, and then they deposit the check. The next one is counterfeiting. So this is really illegally printing checks so they create all new, right, counterfeit checks, but they're using the information from your account. So they'll when they redirect, they can do that by stealing your check, or maybe even redirecting a vendor's check by submitting a request to you to change your remittance address. And they can do some other things with that check, but they can also then get your information and create their own checks and really make it payable to themselves. Because if you think about it, on your check to the vendor, that's all your information, including your bank's name and address, your bank account number, the routing number, even what that signature looks like. And what's even more depressing or scary is the fact that now they have your vendor's remittance information on that check. And that really is a concern too, because now they know what your vendor's invoice structure is, and they can use that information to create a fraudulent invoice that looks very legitimate, right? And send that in and really have a better chance of getting that paid. So really, these are the things that the vendors are doing, or that the fraudsters, both internal and external, are doing with these checks. And so you really do need to be concerned. And we will talk about how Repay can help with that. But first, let's get into the 5 steps to avoid check fraud when paying your vendors. Now, step 1 is really making sure that you are collecting a valid remittance address, making sure it's really coming from your vendor. And so what you want to do is you want to make sure that you're requiring your own documents. Yes, I know that they can submit their information on, I don't know, maybe they have some communication that they're sending to everyone because maybe they moved, but you really want to require your own information or your own document to collect the information that you need in order to change that remittance address. And I would also also say, at the same time, collect a W-9 and W-8, because you never know. They may not know that they need to let you know that they changed their name or maybe even their tax ID, and that's why they're moving. They may just know that they're just trying to get their checks sent to the right place. And so you want to make sure that you're collecting additional information that you can use to validate to make sure nothing else has changed. Also, a couple key points here is do not make changes based on an invoice. First of all, how you going to catch it? And I know a lot of invoice solutions now have AI, and yes, they can catch when some information from the invoice is different than the information that's in your vendor master file, but not everyone has that. And so, and even if you do, you still want to make sure that you have your own separate process and forms for making updates to vendor addresses or remittance addresses, just to make sure that it's not a fraudulent request or not a fraudulent invoice. And then also, don't assume it's valid just because it came from an internal employee. Yes, I know a lot of them have relationships with the vendors, and so you would think that they would collect documents from a valid vendor since they know that it's the vendor, and they wouldn't collect it from the fraudster, but they get social engineered too. They don't pay attention. They don't have the same due diligence mindset that we have when making these changes. And so you want to make sure you're following your own processes when updating the remittance address. So you want to require your own documents, and then on the documents, you want to require some authenticating data. And what I mean by that is you want to ensure that it's not a fraudster by putting in extra steps, right? So you want additional data that you can use to compare to what's already on your vendor record before you make that change. Or if it's a new vendor, what's already known before you add that vendor to your vendor master file. So if it's an existing vendor, you want to collect the previous remittance address and just verify that it matches what's already in your vendor record. Also, if they have a tax ID or global vendor registration number, because it's not all about the tax ID. Other countries have tax, business, individual registration numbers that you can check as well to make sure that vendor is valid. Also, I would recommend that you always collect the internal team member that they have a relationship with. And then if anything looks suspicious, the email, the request, the documents, you've got someone that you can reach out to. Also, all three of these things, right, you're requiring more than most people do. And so some fraudsters, the lazy ones, will just give up and go on to the next potential victim. That's not asking for all of this information. And the last piece, so we always talk about that confirmation call for a change in banking. Well, how about also a change in remittance advice as well? It doesn't hurt to do it. Yes, I know that there's some issues with the confirmation call, but if you're already doing it for the bank account validation change, then also do it for the change in remittance addresses as well. Now, when you confirm that it did come from your vendor and not from a fraudster, step 2 is to validate that vendor address. And so you want to validate really 2 things, or at least 2 things. 1 is that it can be mailable, and 2 is that it belongs to the vendor. So mailability, and again, all of these links will be clickable in the PDF, but mailability, you can always check USPS for their lookup tool by address if it's a US address. They also have publication 28 that gives like a image, right, of what it needs to look like if it is, what that format needs to look like if it is a non-US address. But I would suggest going to the Universal Postal Union, which is just like USPS, is just for non-US addresses, and they have formats for quite a few countries, and some of them they will have additional links that you can click on based on the country, so you can get like a lookup tool so that you can do the same thing for non-US addresses. And speaking of that, the next two, Melissa Data and Smarty, are both platforms where you can bulk upload addresses, like if you're doing a vendor master file cleanup, but they also have single lookup tools, and that can help you to validate that your vendor address is mailable. Smarty I really like because they will also give you the status of the address. They'll tell you if it is inactive, if it's vacant, right? They will give you the status of the address as well. And both of those are paid services, but I know Smarty has a free tier, so you might want to check them out. And then once you confirm that it's mailable, because you don't want to send that check out and have it come back, then you need to confirm, if you can, that it belongs to the vendor. I once ran into a vendor team that for every vendor address, they did a Google search just to make sure that address came up for that vendor. That may or may not work, but it is an option for you. We did do it once. We did do it when we thought that there was any red flags, just to see, right, where that address comes up. And I've said this before, for one particular one, we found that it was a parking lot next to a liquor store. So it can come in handy. Also, if you have a public company, you can check EDGAR, which is the SEC's database, and they will have addresses that will be tied to the vendors. And so you can check there. Everybody knows Microsoft, and you can check the SEC for the different forms that they file. And Microsoft is always one Microsoft way. And then how about other public data platforms like LexisNexis? One thing I do want to, one tip, and it's not just for this, but this can it can help for finding and confirming addresses as well, is the IRS tax exempt record. So if you have a nonprofit, a charity, you can use that link, and I do recommend it in addition to the IRS 10 match when you're setting those up, just to make sure they really are a charity. But one of the results that comes back when you do a search on them is the address. So that can be a tie to the vendor name, to that nonprofit, if you check IRS tax exempt records. All right, so now that you have the vendor address validated, you've entered it into your accounting system or ERP. Now you need to make sure that you don't have unauthorized people actually looking at it. So you want to make sure that you have least privilege access at all times. And so that really means that you really only give access to those that absolutely need it. And so in your accounting system or ERP, in addition to that, you want to make sure that you have, you're approving or have approval for all adds and changes, especially if you have a segregation of duties issue, right? That's a compensating control, but you can do that anyway to make sure that there's no unauthorized changes, right? And so if you've got someone that has access to edit, if you don't have least privilege access in place, you can make sure that you are verifying before that change is made, that someone is reviewing and approving. And in some systems, it'll like automatically trigger a request. Other systems, it might trigger an email. Other systems, you might just have to run a report. Also, make sure you limit who has access to view it, because you don't want to go through all this training, put all these controls in place, and then I always call her Helpful Sally in another department that just wants to be helpful. Fraudsters can contact her. She'll go in and tell them everything that that they ask, including what the existing remittance information. If you remember from the first step, that's part of what you're asking for your authenticating information. And so you don't want anyone else to give that out. So make sure you limit who has access to view. And then you also want to make sure you're reviewing the audit logs, making sure that no one has changed a vendor address. And then perhaps that internal employee, right, will change a vendor address right before the pay cycle runs and then change it back right after the pay cycle is over, right? But if you view your audit logs, you can find that. Make sure you, in your audit logs, if you can, you capture the before and the after values. But if you don't want to do that, maybe you have the option to automate that process. Your IT team or systems team can automate it in the background by comparing the vendor's address to anywhere you have an employee address stored, like for, I don't know, their maybe they have a vendor record because you're paying them reimbursement, or maybe they can check it against payroll records, and then just notify you if there's ever any matches. And then lastly, make sure you're always doing a recurring security audit. People leave, especially people get transferred to different departments, and that's not always reflected in the update of what they have access to in the system. So always make sure you're doing a recurring security audit. I always recommend everything monthly, but if you can't do it monthly, do it quarterly, semi-annually, at the very least annually. And then step 4 is to make sure you're always protecting your check payments. So from the checks themselves, you want to make sure you're using the latest security check security features. You want to store checks, but only store like blank check paper. So if they get the if the checks were stolen, then they've just got, you know, a bunch of blank check paper. Also, make sure you store checks securely before mailing. Don't leave them out on the reception desk. Make sure that you lock them up either in the mail room, and if you have a mail room, make sure you lock it up. We used to have one, not at the past company I was at, but a different smaller company, where everyone would take a shortcut through the check room because that was the closest to the exit. That's really bad. You need to make sure that you're always securing your checks so that no one can pick up a check or random check before they are delivered to the post office or before the mail carrier comes and picks them up. And then if you do need to deliver them to the post office, if there's no mail carrier, make sure you do deliver it to the post office and take it inside and deposit those checks in the inside collectible bin, or however they have you, slide that in the slot, or in that big machine you can put in more multiple checks, but don't put them in the blue mailboxes, because as I've talked about, those checks are being stolen because the mail carrier keys are being stolen. And then also your bank can help you to prevent check fraud, right? Make sure you have the right positive pay. So when we all say positive pay, the assumption is that positive pay is good and great, and it really is, but you need to make sure that it's more than just checking the amount and the check number. You also want to make sure you have payee positive pay. So it's not only checking the amount or the check number, but also checking the payee. Because if you don't have payee positive pay, then a fraudster can get a hold of a check, just change their name and not change the amount and the check number. And that means that check is going to be deposited. Also, some best practice advice is if you have multiple checking accounts, which a lot of companies do, or multiple bank accounts, I will say, which a lot of companies do, but you have some bank accounts that do not have checks written off of them, you want to make sure that you put on there post no check. So if any counterfeit check comes through, it won't get cashed. Also, make sure you're doing a daily bank reconciliation so you can catch those checks, and do that in the morning. So if there are any issues, you can contact your bank before they process those checks. And then also make sure you're reviewing those check images, turn around in the back, check who is endorsing those checks. And then lastly, number 5, I talked about doing confirmations, but here's one confirmation that I would suggest that you do, especially if you have a check that is a large amount, maybe a larger amount than you typically will write. You will confirm that they received the payment, right? So contact them within 5 to 7 days, verify the check amount and the check number, and then also make sure sure that you're reconciling your vendor statements on a regular basis. So if they didn't receive the check and that invoice, that the invoice or invoices that the check was supposed to pay is still on the statement, you can contact the vendor. And then also make sure you're processing return checks immediately. Again, you want to make sure that your addresses are mailable and that they belong to the vendor. So if that didn't happen, those checks are going to come back and now you've got rework, but you do want to make sure you process those immediately because you could have a vendor that is probably calling you anyway because they haven't been paid. All right, so those are the 5 steps that you want to make sure you put into place to avoid check fraud when paying your vendors: collecting a valid remittance address, validating that remittance address, securing that remittance address, protecting those check payments, and then also verifying that the vendor received the payment. Now, if you're ready to get out of these steps, though, because it is additional work, when was protecting anything not additional work, you can actually outsource your check payments. And if you think about it, you do the same thing with payroll, and that is where repay comes into play. So here's why companies give their payments right to repay. Everything that I just recommended, repay does, but there are really 4 main points: saving time and reducing your costs. They mitigate the risk, they support efficiency, and they really provide a seamless integration with your process. And these are really the pillars why Repay's technology and really their team members are so beneficial to the customers. So if you want to know how to get started, it all starts with a discovery call. You can reach directly out to Thomas Cole-Ross on the using the email address that's on the slide, or you can take a picture of the QR code and schedule a demo. Now, here's some more information if you would like to reach out to me, and I just went past it really quickly. But if you wanted to, say, for example, take a look at some of the other webinars that are part of this free webinar series, actually this year, last year, any year, you can go to my website and then go to the webinars page and check those out as well. And then now we are at Q&A. And so if you think of questions afterwards, you can always email me at Debra@DebraRRichardson.com, and I will respond within 24 hours. Or if it is a question for repay, I will forward to them for a response as well. So I do want to just have a last call for questions here. I don't see any that are in the question area. And again, a last call for questions. We have about 2 minutes left. If anyone has any questions that they want to key in there. So I do want to say too, while we're waiting for any questions to come in, that those of you that are interested in checking out or seeing where or how these fraudsters are getting a hold of your check pay or your checks by going into those blue mailboxes. I talked before about the U.S. Inspection Service. You might want to check them out. They have their own website. You can Google them, it'll come up, or you can go from the USPS site, and they have an alert, a news subscription alert, where you can be alerted anytime there are any wanted posters or alerts that are posted for your area. And you can also just go on the site and find, and it's very eerie to see, but they have pictures of where these fraudsters or thieves are actually stealing from the carriers, because they want to try and find them, right? So also they'll have the pictures of them. So check fraud is trending. It's not going anywhere. Make sure you have these 5 steps in place. And I don't see any questions that came through. So I do want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar, for registering and attending. And I'm going to go ahead and end it here. So thanks everyone for attending. I hope you have a great rest of your day. All right, so that was the webinar. I hope you were able to get at least some 2 or 3 good tips, if not more, and you were able to follow along with the 5 steps. So that is it for today. Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 305th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.